Welcome to Proving the Point, where we discuss important research papers that you should know about. Today we're going to talk about this paper called Opioids Are Responsible for Neurochemical Feminization of the Brain in Prenatally Stressed Male Rats. And so what this paper is talking about is basically if you take pregnant rats, and this probably applies to humans as well, which we'll talk about, but if you take pregnant rats and you subject them to psychological stress, their male offspring are more feminized. Okay, and feminized in relation to their blood hormones, so like lower testosterone levels, feminized in relation to their brain structure, as well as their behavior and even sexual behavior. Okay, we'll talk more about that in a minute. We'll also talk about why that matters. So if this applies to humans, which again, there's evidence that it might, this could potentially explain increasing rates of LGBTQ plus identity. So things like homosexuality and maybe transgenderism. Now, we'll talk about why that matters in a minute. But just to finish explaining the title, these authors, they argue that opioids are responsible for this connection between stress and feminization of males. Specifically, opioids, which you might know those as painkillers. Well, your body produces opioids on its own, naturally. Those are called endogenous opioids. And one of the times that it produces those is following stress. So when your body is stressed, it eventually needs to calm down from that stress and return to a baseline state. Well, it releases these opioids, these endogenous opioids, the painkillers, following stress, so that way it can return the body back to baseline. And what these authors find is that it actually seems to be those opioids released following stress that are feminizing the male offspring of these rats. Okay, that has important implications too, because as we're going to talk about, and as you are probably familiar with, there's an opioid crisis happening where prescription opioids are being overused and abused, and people are becoming addicted to these extensively. So if they're causing feminization of offspring, male offspring specifically, then that could potentially cause endocrine problems throughout the population. Okay, so why does this paper matter? It matters because, like I said, LGBTQ plus identities are increasing in prevalence in our society. And for the most part, the big problem with that is related to our fertility rates, okay? So our fertility rates in Western society is very low, and it's probably the biggest threat that our civilization faces because we're not having enough kids, and what that means is that we have a top-heavy demographic curve, which means people are growing older, but there aren't enough young people to basically labor to support them. And what that means is that we have to import laborers in order to support the elderly population. And so that gives way to mass immigration, economic migrants. And as we're seeing, that causes cultural conflict and ultimately the loss of important cultural values and important religious values and things like that. And so our civilization seems to be eroding largely as a consequence of mass immigration. Mass immigration is largely a consequence of our low fertility rate, and our low fertility rate is caused by many things, one of which is increasing rates of LGBTQ plus identity. Okay, so how does LGBTQ plus identity lower our fertility rates? Well, one is through direct mechanisms, which is obvious, which is, let's take someone who's exclusively homosexual. Obviously, they can't conceive a child the natural way. Sometimes they can using artificial means, but ultimately they have low fertility rate directly because of that. A similar thing is true of transgender people, okay? If they remove their reproductive organs, then obviously they can't have children. And most of them can't have children the conventional way either. And there's evidence that those who do, their children are less healthy, which we might talk about in future videos. Okay, so it seems to be lowering the fertility rate through direct mechanisms. Probably more significant is that it might lower the fertility rate through indirect mechanisms. Okay, so there's been sort of an attack, or at least a deterioration of the gender binary, with the idea that men are supposed to be masculine and that women are supposed to be feminine. And I think that is causing a lot of gender confusion, and I think that's making it difficult for males and females to form unions, okay? So, in other words, males, they're wired to be attracted to feminine females. Females are wired to be attracted to masculine males. Well, today, males are becoming more feminine, females are becoming more masculine. That makes each group less appealing to the other. And I think that's probably an underappreciated explanation for why people aren't getting into romantic relationships and they're not getting married and divorce rates are high. It's because the attraction is going away, because the gender binary is going away. Okay, so I think we need to figure out what's causing feminization of males. And by the way, that's empirical. So like testosterone levels in men are declining. Women are becoming more masculine in terms of their social ambitions and things like that. So I think this is probably contributing to our declining fertility rate. All right, it's worth saying at the beginning that doesn't mean that people who experience LGBTQ plus identity are a net harm to society all the time. It's just on this one dimension related to fertility. It doesn't mean they can't have other positive attributes. Okay, so I feel compelled to make this qualifier because I know a lot of people who fall into that category. So I'm a teacher, and as a teacher, you get to meet a wide range of people. And I've known people now who fall into this category, including, homosexual and transgender. And I would never say that they don't have value to bring to the world. And I think that we do need to be careful, especially those of us who are very right-wing. They still can have value. It's just the fertility rate is really the big issue that they bring. Okay? All right. So we need to basically figure out what's causing that, so that way then we can address those root causes. All right. Before we get into the study, in terms of what causes LGBTQ plus behavior, it turns out it's very complicated, but I would say there's kind of three broad potential causes. So one potential cause that's been put forward is that it's genetic. These people have some sort of genetic change that predisposes them to be LGBTQ+. Okay, I suppose that's a possibility. There aren't a lot of genetic studies showing that. And I think the rate of change in LGBTQ+ behavior is increasing so quickly that genetic explanations are not very convincing. It seems like it's something in the environment causing it. Okay, another potential explanation for increasing LGBTQ+ identity is the social contagion model, which we might talk about in future videos. But that's exactly what it sounds like it is. That's the idea that these identities are sort of like a social fad, and they're socially profitable in some circles and in some environments to identify this way. Because, if it's, for example, a very liberal area, then they might be celebrated for having that identity. And so it confers to them a social advantage. All right, so there's the idea that there might be a social contagion happening. And I think a lot of young people are hungry for an identity, a group that they can belong to, a sense of belonging, because they're lonely and isolated, and they've been cut off from their other identities. So I think they're probably gravitating to this. I think that's probably a big portion of it, but I think there are a lot of individuals for which there is a genuine biological, phenomenon causing that. And some of the causes of that are thought to be endocrine disruptors. So these are chemicals from the environment that basically alter people's endocrine system, which is their hormone system. So specifically sex hormones. There's a lot of chemicals in the environment, okay, like plastics, like bisphenol A. It's a well-studied plasticizer with endocrine disrupting effects. Okay, they basically alter people's sex hormones and therefore alter their physiology and fertility and things like that, and puberty and development and things like that. So there's a lot of artificial chemicals that are acting as endocrine disruptors, causing potentially a lot of these issues. And then, as this article talks about, there's what I would call endogenous endocrine disruptors, which are basically molecules made by the body that disrupt the endocrine system. And this would include things like stress hormones and, as this article talks about, endogenous opioids potentially. So when stress or the opioid system are overactive or underactive at certain times during development, that can alter sexual development and psychological development in ways that are reminiscent of homosexuality or transgender identity. All right. So we're going to go through this paper and talk about some of the background. And it's a very, very short paper, so there's not a whole lot to say about this. We're mainly going to focus on the background and then go through a few of the results. All right. So what they talk about here is that we've known for decades now that prenatal stress feminizes and demasculinizes the sexual behavior of adult male rats. Okay, so I think we'll talk about this actual paper that they reference here in a future video. But what they mean by that is that studies have shown that if you, again, stress pregnant female rats, their male offspring are more feminine. And again, what that relates to, it's things like lower testosterone levels. It's reduced anogenital distance. So not to be crude, but the distance between the anus and the genitals in males, the smaller that distance, basically the more developmentally feminine they are. Okay, so it's well used as a marker for endocrine disruption in males. So that's more aligned with female physiology in stress-exposed males. Okay, they have more feminized play, these male rats, meaning one, they don't play with the females as much. Two, they don't do like rough and tumble play as much as the other rats that are not exposed to stress. Okay, their sexual behavior is more reminiscent of females, so they engage in more what's called lordosis, which is basically just a more submissive sexual posture and less mounting of females. So again, that's reminiscent of homosexual behavior. And they have more feminized brain structures and others too. But the point is, it's well established that prenatal stress demasculinizes male rats. Okay. And like I said, this probably applies to humans too, to an extent, because even though like the process of sexual differentiation is different between rats and humans, cortisol, the main stress hormone, is known to disrupt sexual differentiation in humans. So it's probably the case that stress-exposed males, when they're exposed prenatally, that alters their sexual development. And as they cite here, again, maybe we'll talk about it in a future video, but human males exposed to stress in utero seem to have increased rates of homo and bisexual behavior in adulthood. Okay, and there's another study that we might talk about that shows it might be something similar in females, where females are actually more masculinized in their play if their mothers were stressed during pregnancy. Okay, so that's some of the background. They talk about like the mechanism, the biological mechanism involved in the stress response. We're not too concerned about the details for this paper. The main thing is just like I said before, following stress, the body activates its endogenous opioid centers, okay, and responses. And the reason for that, again, is because opioids help bring back down the stress response. Okay, so stress ultimately leads to a opioid production. All right, and so they hypothesize here that maybe it's the opioids that are mediating the effects of prenatal stress on sexual development of the male rats. Okay. So they talk again about how opioids have already been established to interfere with hormonal pathways influencing the gonads, the reproductive organs. So that provides sort of a plausible biological mechanism. And interestingly, they talk in here about how it's been empirically shown that if you inject opioids, like beta endorphin, that's an example of an opioid, into pregnant rats, that alters sexual differentiation of their male offspring. Okay, so again, consider that in light of the opioid epidemic. So a lot of people are becoming addicted to opioids, prescription opioids, painkillers. Think about the consequences of that if it's truly the case that in humans, exposure of pregnant women to opioids would basically feminize their male offspring. Okay, that could predispose them to homosexuality or potentially being transgender. Okay, so they go on to talk more about the brain regions involved in this. We're not super concerned about that again, except the main brain region that they'll be talking about in this paper is what's called the preoptic area. So that's involved in male sexual development. So that's the one they typically look at in this paper. It says the brain preoptic area of rodents is identified as a neuroendocrine center of male sexual behavior. So if, as we'll see, that region of the brain gets altered by stress, then that could lead to altered male sexual behavior. Okay, so what they did in this paper is they took rats and while they were gestating, specifically on days 15 to 21 of gestation, they were subjected to 1 hour of immobilization stress, where basically they were immobilized, restrained physically, and that stresses them out. One group was not stressed at all. One group was stressed, and that's it. And then the third group was stressed, but then they were given this naltrexone drug, and that's an opioid blocker. Okay, so if opioids were causing the effect of prenatal stress on offspring sexual behavior, then giving this opioid blocker should basically block those effects. So that was their reasoning. Okay, and then they measured various metrics of brain masculinization. And so now we'll look at that. We'll look at the results. Okay, so like I said, this is a short paper. There's only 2 figures. This first figure, it's showing basically the 3 groups. So again, the controls, that's the C. PS is prenatal stress. NT is that naltrexone plus prenatal stress. And it's in this first panel of figure 1, it's showing the levels of activity of the protein aromatase. Okay, aromatase, that's a protein involved in basically testosterone metabolism. Okay, and it has an important role in modulating sexual development. That's really all you need to know. And this first panel, it's showing in that preoptic area. Okay, which again, remember, that's part of the region of the brain that's responsible for male sexual development, or at least one of them. And so it's comparing females and males. So the white bars, females, the gray bars, males. These are the offspring of the rats, the female rats. And what you can see is that if you look in control conditions, the male rats had higher activity of this aromatase enzyme. So that basically just, again, means more handling of testosterone, if we want to keep it simple, okay, compared to the females. Okay, and if you look at this prenatally stressed group, what you can see is if you compare the gray bar of the control to the gray bar of the prenatally stressed group, there's a massive reduction in aromatase activity, signifying a problem with testosterone handling. Now, what's interesting is whenever you stress the mother, but you also give them this naltrexone drug to block opioids, it basically rescues the aromatase, returns it back to its normal levels. So what this suggests is that it is indeed the opioids that's causing the problem, because when you block the opioids, the problem disappears. And the effect on the female is not really important here. There's no statistical significance there. And over here, this is just a different brain region that they look at, but we don't really need to worry about that because it's not as involved in sexual development. Okay, down here, this is really their only other main result that we're going to look at in figure 2. The graph is set up the same way. So again, we're going to just ignore the right panel. But the left panel is the preoptic area, except now we're looking at noradrenaline content. So this is basically stress hormone levels in the preoptic area in the rats in these different conditions. So if you look in the control group, at baseline, the males have lower levels of stress hormone in their preoptic area. But when the mother is prenatally stressed, or rather when the mother is stressed, and these individuals are prenatally stressed, that causes higher stress hormone levels in the males compared to the control group. And again, if you give them the naltrexone and they had prenatal stress, that partially rescues that. So it again lowers stress levels in the males. Okay, so that's really their only findings. Again, figure 1 is really the main one, and it's a short paper. What really matters here is the background. But like they say here, the main takeaway from this is just, they say, we postulate that prenatal stress selectively impairs the male rat brain preoptic area, which is related to neuroendocrine control of male sexual behavior. Okay, and it does that through opioids, because when you block opioids, the situation is returned to normal. So that's pretty much the paper. Like I said, the reason this matters is because LGBTQ plus behavior is increasing in frequency, and it's causing at least one problem, which is reduced fertility rate. And so if we're going to combat that, then we need to address its root causes, and one of its root causes is evidently prenatal stress and opioid exposure. So before leaving, one last thing to say is consider that pregnant women are probably more stressed than ever before, because in addition to having to carry the child, they're having to do so while also holding a job for the most part. So, it used to be the case that females didn't have to work, especially during pregnancy, and they were instead taken care of. But now women and men pretty much both have to work in order for a family to be economically stable for the most part. So in addition to having the normal stress associated with being pregnant, they have work stress, they have probably greater economic stress, and all the other stresses that are increasing in our society. So people's psychological well-being is worse than ever before, in modern society at least. And that's almost certainly increasing maternal stress during pregnancy, which is probably accelerating this problem. Okay? In addition to that, we have opioid use increasing. That's also accelerating this problem. So if we're going to get serious about addressing this problem, then we need to address those root causes. But we'll talk about some of these other papers related to this in future videos. Thanks for listening.